Hi, I'm your host Jürgen Strauss from InnovaBuzz, and I'm really excited to welcome today to the InnovaBuzz podcast all the way from Seattle in Washington, the USA, John Rossman. He's the author of the Amazon Way book series, and he's also managing partner at his own company, Rossman Partners. Welcome to the InnovaBuzz podcast, John. It's a great privilege to have you as my guest.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and great to talk to you and hopefully provide your audience with some interesting takeaways.
Excellent. Now, you were an executive at Amazon for many years, and you played a key role in launching the Amazon Marketplace business, which I'm sure I certainly have used. Most of the listeners have probably had some experience with it, and you're an expert in leveraging the Amazon leadership principles to help others innovate, compete, and win, which is what you do in your own company. Now, before we start digging into all of those things, which I'm really excited to do, what's the impact you're making in the world today? You know, people say that when we're no longer here, the impact lives on. So what's the impact you're making today?
Well, I think it comes in a couple of different ways. I'm fortunate to have a great family, and hopefully I'll live on kind of through my kids. And honestly, that's been just a tremendously gratifying part of and priority in my life. But I get nice feedback every week from somebody reading either the Amazon Way or my newsletter, the Digital Leader newsletter, and just saying, hey, thanks for the, simple little tip or suggestion or technique to help us, think a little differently, to pursue root cause and friction a little bit more. And, ultimately, I just want to be remembered as a, practical strategist and a practical problem solver, and having helped, lots of different types of companies, compete better. And that's, I leave behind hopefully some nice books that even when they've aged, like the nice thing about writing about principles
Yeah.
is they are meant to be durable in nature. Can't say they last forever, but the essence of them is they're not time bound. They hopefully age really well, and they advance kind of slowly.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I really, one of the things that I really liked about the book, I really liked a lot of them. The latest one, the 14 Leadership Principles, is exactly that. It talks about principles. So you start off talking about the principle, what it means in a high level sense, and then what it meant in, or what it means in Amazon, and how it's applied, and then you give examples with stories of how people lived those principles, which is another key point that I'll touch on in a moment. So there are 14 principles, and as I was going through preparation for this, I thought, is there a Lord of the Rings moment, like the one principle that rules them all? And if I had to choose, I'd say it was the first one: obsess over the customer. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think that that's probably pretty fair. The customer obsession, it was, Bezos launched Amazon with the stated clear goal of being the world's most customer-centric company ever. And the rest of these principles kind of developed. I was at Amazon from early 2002 through late 2005. These principles weren't codified. Like, they weren't like, oh, these are the principles. We were hammering them out and figuring out, like, oh, like, how do we solve in this situation? What do we prioritize here? How do we work together? What are the different types of styles or approaches to leadership? And after I left Amazon, a couple of years after I left Amazon, they codified these. And, I think I always say, like, the book, my work, it's not about Amazon, it's about you. And, like, how can you compete different? How can you help avoid bureaucracy and equip everybody in your team to kind of do the right thing and to think appropriately given the circumstance? And that's why I think more than one practical, it can be a tenet, it can be a guideline, it can be a principle. Like, you can pick your word. Rules tend to be too rigid, and lofty ambitions like, do the right thing or be a
Yeah.
good partner, those aren't refined enough to do it. And that's why, Amazon, they ended up with 14. They actually have 16 now. And as you read the book, I made a suggestion
You
to
made a
them for an
suggestion. That's right.
addition.
Yeah.
I'm not claiming that they listened to me, but I think it was clear they had a couple of topics that they needed to address, and that's what I suggested to them. And they, the thing I love about them is, they're vocally self-critical and like, yeah, we need to act bigger than sometimes we have in the past, and we need to prioritize employee experience and safety. And so they're working on those things, and those were important enough that they made them 2 new principles in their set. It is a lot to digest. In the book, I one of the appendixes is about building your own principles, and one of the things I suggest is don't rush into it. Take your time, draft your principles, live with them for a while, practice them, and then over time they become real habits, and you'll figure out what's the right approach for us.
Yeah, I lost you for just a moment there, but I think I got the gist of that. And certainly one of the principles is being self-critical, and also there's another one there, disagree and commit, which I think, if my interpretation is correct there, it's having the permission almost to challenge the status quo, and having constructive debate around what perhaps needs to change,
Yeah.
even at the principles level.
Yeah, it's called Have Backbone, Disagree, and Commit, and it reads that leaders are obligated to respectfully challenge decisions when they disagree, even when doing so is uncomfortable or exhausting. Leaders have conviction and are tenacious. They do not compromise for the sake of social cohesion. Once a decision is determined, they commit wholly. And so it really is about having truth-seeking moments where we use customer obsession and data and insights and problem-solving skills to really understand the situation. Play your cards at the table, park seniority, park those things that don't matter. But when the decision maker makes a decision, we all have to wholeheartedly work to make that successful. And if you have that, like, hey, we have the decision, we play the game, but then we make a decision with the appropriate tone and tempo and speed in the organization, you're gonna make better decisions as a team. The team's gonna understand better why this decision was made. They're going to be able to replicate that type of approach on their own at the right moments. And you're going to have a respectful balance between decision-making rights and kind of control versus everybody participating and debating on a topic. And you need both of those things. Consensus is a really it's a dangerous mindset to have when you're trying to solve hard problems or do hard things. It can be important on some aspects, like, what do we serve for lunch? Well, you want to have consensus on a decision like that, right? You want to try to please the most people. But like, do we invest, like, which of these ideas do we invest in? We have 5 good ideas. Consensus probably isn't the right approach to making a decision like that, right? So you have to have the right approaches for the right moments.
Yeah, and I think you also highlighted that there's 2 parts to that, which is when the decision is made, that however that decision is made, that everybody then is 100% on board with it. And I think a lot of my experience in where there was the ability to have those kind of conversations, although usually there was still something hidden, there was still somebody holding back some cards, because they would then play out later on, and it became evident that they didn't agree with the decision and they were not 100% committed to that direction. Which, that's the 2 parts, isn't it? They have to come together.
It is, and part of the obligation is on the decision maker and how you facilitate meetings to clearly articulate what the decision is, communicate it out in written substance so that people can peg it and reference it, and you can refer back to it and everything, right? And so oftentimes somebody thinks they've made the decision, but if only you know about the decision, or a limited few, and you don't have kind of the testimony of, like, how you got there and whatnot, well, then it's harder for others to respect that decision and understand how we got there.
Yeah, that's right. All right. Well, I had a thought there about the I'm not sure what you call it, but basically writing, instead of doing the PowerPoint presentation, writing out the long documents, which are the briefs. But
Yeah.
I'll come back to that in a moment. I wanted to come back to this principle of obsessing over the customer, which is, you alluded to it, that was kind of one of the first ones that was articulated. Give us an example where that really highlights how that worked, how people lived that, not just an executive making a decision, but sort of on the maybe even in a distribution center
Yeah.
or something like that, where people actually, they didn't have guidelines or something, but that they lived this philosophy.
Yeah, so the principle is about customer obsession, and leaders work to build and meet customer trust, and while you pay attention to competitors, you obsess about customers, and I think that there's really two types of customer obsession. There's kind of tactical customer obsession, and there's strategic customer obsession. And both are important. Tactical customer, centricity or customer obsession is about like, hey, how do we get today's order, today's transaction, today's customer experience, and hit our promise to the customer today. And that's really kind of your operational excellence, and like, hey, we have to get this right today.
Hmm.
And then there's the strategic customer obsession, which is like, how do we become curious and understand our customer bigger and broader and deeper than just our product or our service or our business today, looking for insights into that customer so that you can better serve them. And that's going to take you into some wandering opportunities where you can expand that customer relationship and hopefully serve them bigger and broader. And if you think about Amazon's 27-year journey, it's really been about expanding the customer journey and who the customer is, taking those moments like, oh, well, we could probably create a better approach to that particular aspect of the customer experience or something like that. In early example, you asked for an example. So one of the examples I participated in and remember was, so this is back in 2002, and back then, broadband wasn't available, and so people were, it was a mix of dial-up modems and cable modems, and there was, spotty and inconsistent website performance. And, our team was challenged like, hey, you need to improve how detail pages, the product pages, are rendered to customers. And we were like, hey, we're only accountable for so much of this experience. The whoever the provider is
Hmm.
actually responsible. And like, we got back a firm like, no, you need to be more curious in that. So what we went on to was like, well, how would we measure the real to the glass customer experience, to the computer screen, the glass being the computer screen,
Hmm.
to the computer screen customer experience? And what we figured out was we were able to actually influence the customer experience way broader and way more significantly than our initial kind of peripheral, non-curious, and get through it quickly approach had. First, we were able to work with a lot of the providers, pointing out to them like service deficiencies and problems they were having. Secondly, we actually redesigned, re-engineered how product pages are delivered to a computer depending upon the type of connection that a customer had. And so we broke it up more refined, and we would deliver the appropriate type of web page in the appropriate order depending upon what type of service provider you had, giving a much better customer experience to customers. So that's an example of
Hmm.
really obsessing about what that customer experience was and being willing to really innovate well beyond kind of what the initial
Yeah.
engineering evaluation would be.
And stepping outside your own environment to
That
work with others
partners and
who had
providers.
control, yeah, who
Yeah.
had control over the the bottleneck, if you like.
That's right. That's right. It was. It was exactly it. It was a bottleneck, and we took accountability for part of that bottleneck, and then we partnered with others to address other aspects of that bottleneck.
One of the other principles that I love, and I know there's lots of examples of this in the book, is invent and simplify. And so I'll ask you to talk to us a little bit about that, but I'll also give you a challenge at the end. Well, it's not for you actually, it's for Amazon, so you're no longer with them, but maybe you can issue another invitation.
Sure. So, the third leadership principle is about invent and simplify, and that, leaders at Amazon look for new ways to serve customers. They're willing to invent. And what I always found interesting about that leadership principle is that the and simplify piece, and that we recognize that simplifying was as both important and as hard as inventing. And simplifying isn't just for the customer experience. It's actually more pointed at how we built our internal capabilities, that we had to be able to scale. And scaling meant being able to do more on an improving economic basis, right? Like that's what real scaling is about. And that simplifying our processes, simplifying our jobs, simplifying data flows, simplifying technology, simplifying exception paths. All of those things were the important work to be done in order to scale. If you think about most companies internally, it's calcified, and they're typically calcified because of they haven't addressed complexity internally, right? Things have just been bolted on and added because of acquisitions and projects that don't advance and half done things and initiatives and capabilities that have been left behind. And if you truly want to scale something, you have to go back and re-rationalize, really zero-based design, the approach, the process, the capability to re-engineer it fit for purpose for what the future of your business needs to be. And so that's where I work with some of the most interesting work I get to do is on the complexity and simplification game. And if you think about complexity, it typically lies at the intersection of products, process, and organization. And it typically is embedded in multiple of those axes. And so you really have to understand, like, where is there valuable complexity that serves the customer versus non-value added complexity. And that we have to zero in on and really use that as a lens to improve our capability.
Yeah, and I really love that principle. But one of the things it kept reminding me of, and it was quite almost like a little needle that I was sitting on that was just, that's annoying, is, and this is my experience as a customer of Amazon. So I have one Amazon account. When I log into that account, and that one Amazon account is connected to my Kindle, it's connected to my Audible, it's connected to my affiliate account for Amazon. Depending on what I want to do, I have to log into different accounts. So I have to log in separately to Audible with the same password. I have to log in separately to Kindle with the same password. I have to log in separately to the affiliate dashboard with the same password. But even worse than that is depending on where the IP address sends me in terms of the data going through, it'll log me into Amazon.com. Or it'll log me into amazon.com.au. And for example, books that I've ordered or won't necessarily be on each of those accounts. They won't necessarily show up. So sometimes I find myself, I'm sure I bought that book. I'm sure I've paid for it. And now I've learned that I have to log out of that account, log back in and change something in the IP. So I thought that's an opportunity to simplify something for the customer and obsessing over the customer. And I wonder if anybody's ever gone back to Amazon and said, hey, look, I think there's an issue there. I don't know whether it's me or...
Well, that's an interesting use case. One, I probably don't run into because I don't have kind of the international complexity that you do, I would just suggest, and this email address is well known out there. Send an email to jeff@amazon.com with the situation, and try to break it down as best you can and everything, and maybe it'll find its way to the team that is trying to figure out. Identity is a really tricky thing, a really important concept in this digital world, and getting identity right is a really hard problem, and it's so fraught with fraud, and fraud is
Mm,
becoming such an important aspect and tied to identity. So I don't have any immediate either solution for you or suggestions, but
yeah.
yeah, that's it. That's an interesting use case. That's a hard problem.
Mm. All right. It was just one that I thought we're talking about the invent and simplify and the customer experience. I thought, yes, there's so much good stuff that Amazon is doing and that I'm experiencing as a user. But then that to me was, oh, that's at odds with the certainly with the simplify stuff from my
Well,
point of view.
and it gets to the fact that Amazon, like any good company, understands, like, you're never done reinventing the customer
Mm,
experience. You're never hit perfection. One of the newsletters I wrote in the Digital Leader newsletter was about chasing perfection, right?
mm,
And you're never going to be perfect, but your goal is to be excellent. And you use metrics, you use signals like a customer complaint to recognize where is there still friction in operations, in the customer experience, and you have to have the mechanisms in place in order to address those points of friction. And so that's part of the story, is that you're never done, and
mm.
especially in a complex scenario, there's always opportunities to improve the customer experience.
Yeah, and technology is evolving so quickly as well, right? You touched on security there, and there was an interesting news article yesterday on the news that I saw, and I guess this has been happening for some time, where some of the major technology companies are working on removing the whole idea of passwords and people having passwords that they either have to remember, and then often they choose something really simple, like I think 1234, or there's something like that that is the most common password used. It's
Or
kind of like
password.
or password, yeah. It's kind of like 30 or 40% of all the passwords in the world, which when you think about that is pretty stunning. And the they're working on using biometrics in some form, whether it's iris scans or fingerprints to substitute for passwords. Now that you can do a lot of that already on some of the mobile apps, but of course on PCs or Macs or desktop computers in general, that's a bigger challenge.
Yes, it is.
Hmm. All right. Well, you've mentioned your digital leader newsletter a couple of times, and one of the things you certainly talk about a lot there is digital transformation. And I mean, Amazon were one of the very early big marketplace online sellers. Over the last few years where we've been in this pandemic, a lot of businesses who are in bricks and mortar commerce have transitioned to e-commerce and online selling. What are some of the lessons that you talk about and you've learned from Amazon and from your own experience in this whole digital transformation move?
Yeah, well, first I'd say this isn't about retail, right? Like every
Mm,
industry, every type of business model is undergoing rampant change, really fueled by a technology like cloud computing, new business models, and a ton of capital that's being invested to do exactly this, which is to disrupt the traditional companies out there, right? And so it from my standpoint, in my experience, it's ubiquitous across industries, and none of this is really about retail specifically, but it's about every company and seeking to compete differently in the digital era. And so, the stats are like, essentially like everyone has a digital strategy or is pursuing digital transformation, but yet, 70% of all digital transformations and digital initiatives fail to reach their promise. And so I was just like, well, how can that be? Like, these are smart people, but they continue to invest a ton of money and resource and management attention and hope into these initiatives, but yet they know that they're not successful. And the only conclusion you can come to is because they know they have to do it, right? But they don't quite know, like, what's the recipe to successfully change. And so, digital transformation is made up of two words, digital and transformation. And so, well, what does being digital mean? To me, being digital means two attributes, and those attributes are speed and agility. Speed is really the attribute of seeking perfection, right? Highly efficient, highly effective, highly precision-oriented speed. That's really our operational excellence capability. So digitally transformed organizations have the use digital capabilities and modern techniques to take operational excellence to the next level. And you need to couple that with the skill set of agility. Agility is the ability to be able to sense and make change happen, right? Like that's our innovation capability. And companies need both of those playbooks, a speed playbook and an agility playbook tied together with digital technologies and digital capabilities. So now the question, like, well, what's the secret sauce? Like, what's the playbook in order to successfully digitally transform? So, this is my theory, right, of this, and there's room for different points of view on this. But I think first is organizations don't do a good job of defining the future state, the to state, right? You have to think about the from and the to. What we're really good at, or we tend to be better at, is like commenting about the current state, like what sucks about the current state, what's the issues, what's the frustration. What we have a tougher time doing is imagining the future. Amazon has a technique about working backwards. Start with the future customer experience, and then work backwards. You need to think about, I think, 5 key scenarios in order to improve the future: customer experiences, employee experiences, operations, connected products and services, and business models and value propositions. And so the first thing to do to succeed better at digital transformation is take those 5 scenarios and define your portfolio, specific ideas within those 5 vectors of change that you might improve on, and then rationalize them, right? There's going to be more ideas that you can pursue. Figure out a way to rationalize those and prioritize those. Then once you understand, like, okay, these are the select few ideas that we really want to pursue, you have a better definition of what the future is going to be. You need to think about a set of 5 levers that need to work in concert for you, right? This is about leadership. It's about working backwards. So start with the future in mind and work backwards. You need to think about what's the right set of technologies and capabilities in order to provide, the magic to these capabilities. You need to develop a innovation and agile mindset, right? You need to scan, test, prototype, decide what to scale, what to prune. And then finally, you need to keep score correctly. You need to use the right types of evaluation and metrics at the right moments relative to these concepts. So if you go to my website, theamazonway.com, the-amazon-way.com, I have a framework outlining this is for free, that helps you understand, like, oh, these are the vectors in order to calibrate myself against in order to successfully transform. And my big belief is we need to find little ways in an organization. We need to shrink the change. We need to find little ways, little changes to make that have big impact relative to these concepts, right? Like we're not going to change the essence of every company from, what they are to this, innovative Silicon Valley, organization. Like that's just hyperbole. That's false hope right there. What we have to do is take the essence of a company and its culture and find little ways to help it compete better in the future And so we have to dial ourselves against kind of these five factors and find little ways that we can help do it. That takes real diagnosis to do, right? There's no one
Mm.
playbook that you can play against that, but I really believe it starts with a good, honest diagnosis of, what's our ambition and what's our current state, so that you can really figure out, well, what do we need to do and how do we need to change in order to get there?
Yeah, yeah, I love it. That's very comprehensive. And I love that you said figuring out the small changes that can be made very quickly, because that again comes back to one of the uh, principles that you outlined from Amazon, which is the bias to action. And it occurred to me as you were outlining that, and you also talked about the pursuit of perfection, or which we never achieve, but having the highest possible standards. And there's sometimes that can be at odds, right, with quick action, because people spend all their time planning. They spend all their time, no, we need to refine that a little bit more, and nothing ever gets done. And so the transformation part of that digital transformation doesn't happen.
Yeah, it takes judgment and wisdom, right? You have to know which details are important. What can we be sloppy on? What needs to be, precision oriented and super well thought through. And you can't compete being a perfectionist, right? Like there's no
Yeah.
place. But it's understanding where to have a high bar, and how at moments having a high bar puts you through, whatever the tough moment is, or the tough problem. And that takes real wisdom. And I've seen concepts like that used incorrectly, and you're like, well, everything has to be perfect. No, 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 no. Not everything has to be perfect. The right things
Hmm.
have to be perfect. And we have to have speed, which means calculated risk taking, in order to iterate and to test and to move faster. You can't afford to be slow in making change happen.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really important point. Okay, one of the things I did want to come back to was this idea of the briefing paper. I can't remember exactly the term you used, so
Yeah.
you'll have to refresh my mind on that. But what in Amazon, rather than having this bullet point PowerPoints with a lot of bullet points and a lot of fancy slides, you actually write out the entire scenario, giving examples, and I thought that was a fascinating way of really forcing yourself as the writer into deep thinking about the whole issue, and then of course sharing that document or sharing that story with others then allows that conversation, those constructive discussions that we talked about earlier. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, kind of the Amazon philosophy is called working backwards. Start with the end in mind. Start with
Hmm.
the customer in mind. Work backwards, and the way they do that is through writing things out, right? And the writing has to be specific to where you're at on this problem or proposal. But essentially, every project, every proposal, every complex problem gets written out, and they call these narratives, and they have a specific technique. They do 6 pages, no more. um, and it really is it's a team writing and team thinking process to help a group of leaders, a group of problem solvers, understand together exactly what the situation is and exactly what they're proposing and kind of why. And then those papers, as they go up the organization, meetings start with 15 to 20 minutes of silence, where leaders read those papers, they grok them, they deeply understand, and they'll oftentimes pull out a red line and like edit or debate that, right? And
Hmm.
so that's a real opportunity for a senior leader to specifically change or influence the design or the thinking on a problem or what's going to be built. And what it helps is not just the thinking of the group, but it helps in passing it forward, right, to others who need to participate in whether it's implementing it or taking whatever the next steps are. And then the other, one of the other benefits of doing this is, in 3 months from now or 6 months from now, you can pull this out and you can audit against it, and everything, right?
Hmm.
There's in the book, I outline kind of the specific techniques. There's the narrative, there's the future press release, there's writing FAQs. Sometimes we would write a user manual before we built anything. And this seems like going slow, but it actually is the best way to experiment without building anything, right? You're experimenting by debating these ideas and writing them out in full papers and full paragraphs with full sentences is the best way to thoroughly think through a subtle and complex situation.
Yeah, I really found that fascinating, and I think that it can be really valuable to do that because, like you said, it gives everybody the opportunity to get involved, to understand. And I've seen PowerPoints where after the presentation might be quite exciting, but then afterwards, well, I can't remember exactly what was said there, and you look at the PowerPoint and it's kind of just completely meaningless, right? And so if you go back to measure against that,
that is one of the big weaknesses of PowerPoint is it's the presenter who is really providing the meat of the concepts, not the material itself.
Yeah, which is appropriate in some presentations, but perhaps not in this planning scenario and strategy sessions.
Right, that's right.
All right, well, thanks, John. This has been really great. I think it's a good time now where we can move on to the buzz, which is the same 5 questions I ask of every guest. And the idea is that you'll inspire the listener to go and do something awesome as a result today, to take some action and have some sort of transformation. So
Okay.
You ready?
I'm ready, I think.
What's the number one thing anyone needs to do to be more innovative?
I would go back to the last thing we just talked about, which is write out the idea. Like that is the input that can help you clarify exactly like what your concept is, who your customer, why are they frustrated, and what are you proposing to do about it. So write it out.
And talk to others about it. Have them contribute.
That's right. Get critical feedback. Like don't look for kind of like, hey, nice job feedback.
Well done.
Look for critical feedback, right?
Great. Love it. All right. And what's the best thing you've done to develop new ideas?
I get to work with my clients on them and everything, and I honestly like the thing I've done recently, like the newsletter, has been, I get nice feedback on it, but it's been such a great mechanism for me to clarify some of my thinking on some important topics, to test things out with users, the readers of my newsletter. And so in my business of kind of thought leadership, the newsletter has, I'm coming up on just a year for the Digital Leader newsletter. It's been a tremendously impactful and creative way for me to test concepts out.
Yeah. That's. I was just going to say that's essentially it's another way of doing that writing exercise.
That's right.
Isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. And getting the feedback from the readers. All right. Do you have a favorite resource you use most often?
Well, I use Wikipedia a ton, right? And who would have thought, 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, that probably the best resource for history and facts is a crowdsourced online encyclopedia and everything. So yeah, I use Wikipedia a lot, and I'd say the other thing is I use podcasts and I listen to so much of my content today, and so I appreciate resources like your show that put meaningful, quick bite material out there, and it gives me something to think about.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing with the technology we have today, isn't it? That knowledge essentially is crowdsourced. It's
Right.
available to everybody. In days gone by, we've had to go to public libraries and hope that our local city or local government had a really good public library. Today, we just go on the internet and there's so many different resources.
That's right.
Now, what's the best way to keep a client on track?
What's the best way to keep a client define the mission clearly up front, right? Like so much of my experience in advising and consulting is both parties, both the client and the consultant, didn't truly understand the mission, and kind of nuances around the mission. Like, is it more like this, or is it more like that, or is it more like this, and everything, right? And so taking the time to really define the mission and exploring different angles on it, I think is the number one. I don't know if it's the number one reason, but it's the first thing that oftentimes goes wrong when, we're talking about doing an engagement.
Yeah, that's right. It's it. If you don't set them up front, then people kind of set their own expectations, and they're not necessarily in alignment with all the people involved, right?
Right. I mean, it's the essential challenge of communication. Like, I think I'm being clear. You think you're hearing and understanding, but we're actually kind of talking past each other.
All right. Clarifying expectations up front, really important. And what's the number one thing anyone can do to differentiate themselves?
Oh, I think it's about value proposition design, right? And being super clear about who your customer is and why are they going to love, your product and your service, and how is it different? And I don't think companies or teams really spend enough time in defining their value proposition and kind of like, well, what's the singular, killer feature, reason why your product or your service is going to be differentiated. And, in this highly discoverable world out there, value propositions are all that much important. And especially if you're thinking about introducing new products and services, you have to find one specific reason why it is tremendously better than the competition, and identify with a specific type of user. And that's the way to get to market.
So being really clear on who the user is, and then the value of what your proposed service or product is for them.
Yeah, and there's a lot of good material out there about value proposition definition and helping you explore it and understand it better.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks for getting us through the buzz. And now, where can people reach out to you and learn more about what you do and get a hold of your Digital Leader newsletter, and also, your books will be on the website, I dare say.
So the Amazon Way is available, of course, at Amazon, in paperback, in Kindle, in Audible. You can reach me. LinkedIn is probably the easiest, John Rossman. And the Digital Leader newsletter, you can go to Substack and just search John Rossman or the Digital Leader newsletter, and you'll find it. It's available for free. And that's the best way. I do have a website. It's rossmanpartners.com, but those other three are maybe easier to remember.
Okay. And we'll have links in the show notes so that people can click straight through as well.
Super.
So what action would you like our listener to take away from our conversation today?
Well, think about how are you going to compete in the digital era, and work with your colleagues, work with your company's leadership on building a specific concept, a specific set of hypotheses on how you're going to win in the future. Most companies really only plan in, what we consider kind of the first horizon, right? They really aren't thinking about the second and the third horizon, and you need to be acting and investing and exploring concept as early as possible. So that would be the number one thing I'd recommend for your listeners to do.
Excellent. Well, that's great. So looking out beyond that first horizon, which might be a 12 to 24 months time frame.
Yeah, or even shorter oftentimes, right? It's like this quarter.
Sometimes, yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So what else is out there? What's happening in the environment? What are the opportunities that opens up? Great. All right. Finally, John, who else should I get on the show, and why?
You should get Jeff Bezos on the show. That would be incredible. I saw you had James, last name,
Eichner
on the show. He's excellent. Roger Martin would be a good author and professor to get on the show.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we'll get an introduction to Roger from you and reach out to him, begin that conversation. And yeah, I'd love to have a chat with Jeff. That would be awesome. But I suspect that he might have lots
Hey,
of more important things to do.
I already gave you his email address, so
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, we'll tack on the invitation onto
right
the
on.
feedback. Thanks, John. Thanks so much for sharing your insights and helping us dig deeper into the Amazon way, the principles today. And I'll have to go and look up what the other three new principles, or the other two new principles are. The other one is the one you suggested, but I'll update myself on that and certainly
Perfect.
encourage the listeners to do that as well. And yeah, all the best for the future, and let's stay in touch.
Okay. Well, it was nice meeting you. Thanks for your time.